In today's video, we are going to go over Charles Darwin, his theory of evolution, natural selection, speciation, and all the little things in between and how it relates to biology as a whole. So we're going to annotate as we go and try to make it a little bit more interactive, and let's just jump into it. Here we have Charles Darwin, and let's actually look at his early views, the early views on evolution before his time and his research. So in the 5th century BC, Plato believed in fixed ideal species, and this was kind of the norm for a while. In the 4th century, Aristotle comes along. In the 18th century now, we have Carl van Lijn. In the later 18th century, Georges Cuvier, he connected fossils to ancient ecosystems, and this is important. We'll look back onto this later in the video. Okay, so here in the 18th and 19th century, James Hutton and Charles Lyell introduced the idea of gradualism and an old Earth. So this is kind of a big turning point because prior to the 18th and 19th century, people believed that the Earth was only 1,000 years old. But as we know now, the Earth is actually millions of years old. In the early 19th century, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck connected evolution to adaptation, and he proposed use it or lose it theory and also Lamarckicism, and we'll go over that as well. 1831, 1836, these are the years of that famous Charles Darwin voyage where he goes on the HMS Beagle and looks at those finches. And lastly, 1858, 1859, Darwin and Wallace, they presented all their research and Darwin wrote a book. So Darwin's voyage on the HMS Beagle. So he was a med student originally, or he was studying medicine, but he didn't really like the sight of blood, so he became a naturalist, and he goes and travels across the world, and he travels through Africa, all the way up through the Atlantic, and then down to South America and to these Galapagos Islands near Ecuador. And as he's there, he collects fossil samples, field notes, and he observes these finches. And these finches are very important, and here we'll look at it here. So one big thing about Darwin's theory at the time was that it was very controversial because it went against the common religion and the common idea of God at the time. So fixed ideal species. Everybody believed that, the species was fixed and God created it, and it just stayed like that. But as we come to realize, Darwin notices that when he goes to the Galapagos, he was at the mainland at first, the main center, and there is this common finch. But as he explored these smaller islands, he realized that there's different types of finches with different beaks. Now this is important because that's an example of of evolution and natural selection of what Charles Darwin was proposing. So basically, some islands had different selective pressures that we could say. One island had thick seeds. That was their only food source. So the finches developed these strong, thick beaks. On a different island, they only had insects. So the finches had these skinny, long beaks to grab those insects. And lastly, we have nectar. So now let's look at Lamarckicism versus Darwin. So Lamarck proposed that these giraffes here just stretch their necks, and that's how evolution worked. We've come to realize that this was false. It's a false theory. So Darwin proposed, and he noticed that basically the idea is we have one giraffe and we have two types of giraffes. Now the second type of giraffe just so happened to have a longer neck, and he was able to reach the leaves and the nutrients, so he survived more, he produced more offspring, and eventually, this guy died. Rest in peace to this little short neck giraffe. So anyway, yeah, that's just how it is. These become more successful at reproduction, these giraffes here with the longer neck, and over time we just see more of them here. Okay, now let's move on to Darwin's theory of evolution and really look at it. So we have the first main column here, and I like to look at it sort of as a funnel. Basically, there's two postulates of Darwin's theory. The first one is descent with modification, and that is just known as evolution. The second underlying postulate is natural selection, which is a mechanism of evolution. So here's just the official definition of natural selection, and let me move my camera here so you guys can take a look at the definition. And yeah, so basically, this is where organisms better adapted to their environment will survive and produce more offspring. So we can see here that these beetles that are camouflaged and suited for that black background, they will live more because the birds don't really see them. Alright, the four postulates of natural selection. So just as there were two postulates to evolution, we go deeper into natural selection to its four main postulates. So first off, individuals have variations that make them unique. So that's what we saw in that last photo with the beetles. Now, important part is more offspring than environment can support. And this creates competition, and that's very important. This leads us into survival of the fittest. Now, there's a common stipulation that, or misconception, that survival of the fittest means, the most strongest individual, but that's false. Survival of the fittest means the organism that can produce more offspring and that is fertile and have a lot of offspring. So as we can see here, this guy may not be the strongest in the weight room, but he definitely has a lot of children and offspring, so that's what makes him the fittest. And lastly, we have his last postulate, which is some of these variations are passed on to the offspring. And this is pretty important too, and I want to kind of highlight something about this. If we break it down, there's two types of things that I see on exams. Sometimes they'll ask us to compare inherited versus acquired traits, right? So basically, inherited traits are, look at my notes real quick, from your parents. You are born with these traits. So an example of these is like freckles or your eye color. And you don't have a say in your inherited traits. Freckles are an example, eye color, and you don't really learn these. You're born with them. That's a key one right there. You're just born with them. And acquired traits, this is something like, some examples would be reading skills, or like a scar, if you attain a scar. Do that. And this doesn't just apply to humans, it applies to the plants and animals as well. For example, if there's an elephant and over his lifetime he ends up breaking a tusk, and then he meets his partner and has offspring, that doesn't necessarily mean that his child or his offspring will also have a broken tusk. That's acquired. So acquired traits are not passed on to the offspring. I want to mention that. That's very important to know. Acquired traits are not passed on to offspring. Okay, and there's also artificial selection. And this is pretty simple, but we have to know it. Basically, this is just human selection. So we've come to realize through science that, hey, we can select the ones that we want. So over here, we see this corn. We don't really like it. It's not nutrient dense. So what we will do is we will artificially do some science and reproduce it and get the one that we actually want, which is this nutrient dense corn. So there's some observations that support evolution. We don't worry about all these big definitions here. They're just there for you to know, but we will dive into the very important ones here. So direct observation, that's just what like Charles Darwin did on the island. He observed directly the differences, and also antibiotic resistance. We observed that. Fossil record, this basically just helps us connect ancient organisms together and have a timeline that we can visually see. So there comes Georges Cuvier again. Divergent and convergent evolution, this is pretty important and we'll dive into it deeper. Homologous structures, also important. Vestigial and molecular and biology evidence. And there's also biogeography evidence. These are just similarities and differences in genetic makeup and protein structures. Also, as a quick disclaimer, for these type of bio concepts, they're very factual based. There's not a lot of math going on and stuff. So honestly, we really recommend to just split the screen and put it on to Anki or Quizlet. If you don't know how to use Anki, we love Anki. We have a tutorial and I'll link it right here. And also, mind mapping, if you mind map these type of ideas, they're not really practice math-based problems. It's just kind of memorization and applying it to what you memorized during your learning for exams. Okay, so divergent evolution versus convergent evolution. I see this a lot on these type of bio exams, and it's very simple, honestly. So divergent evolution, this is just when a common ancestor, we don't really know this common ancestor, we just know it's a common ancestor. This basically means that divergent evolution, the descendants of a common ancestor evolve in different directions. So an elephant evolves with, thick, tough skin, and it's made for the heat. And then the mammoth evolves later on with warmer skin, with wool, adapted for the cold, right? Okay, now we have convergent evolution. And this is even simpler. So we have that species share a trait, not due to common ancestor, but due to their environment. So for example, let me check this out real quick. For example, the Arctic fox and this white bird, they don't have much related to each other. They're not related. This is a fox and this is a bird. But what they do have in relation is the environmental pressure of the Arctic. So they adapt with these white coats to hide from predators and survive better. So that's basically the idea of natural selection and evolution. Organisms trying to adapt, trying to survive, and trying to reproduce more. So homologous structures versus analogous structures. Now this is very difficult to learn when you just first see it, and I see it a lot on exams. So homologous structures versus analogous. It's very simple. The key here is to just look or try to zoom out with your scope and really simplify it. A lot of students just overcomplicate it. Homologous structures means that they are from a similar anatomical structure. They have a different function, but they're from a common ancestor. So what does this mean? Well, similar anatomical structure. We can all see that all of these animals have this humerus bone, this radius and ulna bone, and phalanges. They all do. The human has that, and the dog has that, the bird and the whale. However, they all form different functions. A human uses his hands to grab and eat and whatnot. The dog uses his bones to run and jump, and the whale uses his bones to swim. But they do come from a common ancestor. They all come from a common ancestor. Now, analogous structures is just flipped and it's opposite. They have different anatomical structures. They all form similar functions, but they're not from a common ancestor. Now, it's kind of confusing if you look at it, because you kind of generally think, well, the bird and the butterfly and the bat, at first I was like, well, they should be from a common ancestor, right? But in reality, based on science, they're not. But we can look at it that they have a different anatomical structure. So the bird wing is made of like feathers and bones and whatnot. And whenever I look at a bat, I always think of, Batman and kind of leather. It looks kind of leather-ish, and it doesn't have feathers. So that's what they mean by different anatomical structure. But they all form a similar function. They're all used to fly. Vestigial structures, these are just remnants of ancestral homologous structures that have no present function. So the salamander here, he has eyes, but he's blind, right? It's kind of funny. Here, our molar teeth, actually, there's been some studies of like microevolution. Since we're just yanking them out anyway, some people are like evolving to not have it. So our molars are vestigial structures. We don't use it. And so is our appendix. It's a vestigial organ. So some common misconceptions of evolution. Evolution is just a theory. Individuals evolve. Wait, hold on. Let me go back to evolution is just a theory. Yeah, it's just a theory, but there's so much evidence to support it. Individuals evolve. This is false, kind of. Populations evolve based on their environmental pressures. Evolution explains the origin of life. It doesn't really. It's just an idea that is very evidence-backed. Organisms evolved on purpose. They don't. Organisms evolve based on their environmental pressures and natural selection. So formation of new species, we kind of have to know this, and yeah, so let's just dive into it. Formation of new species terminology. So these are just some terms we have to know to get used to species and speciation. So this is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce offspring. A hybrid is a cross between two species, for example, a mule. A gene pool is a collection of all the variants of genes. And speciation, which is the formation of two species from one original species. This is also a concept that we have to know and we're kind of going to be tested on. So biological species concept basically means that members of the same species, they have to share the same gene pool and they are reproductively isolated. So there's two types of speciation we have to know. We have allopatric and sympatric. And what are the differences between these two? Well, allopatric involves geographic isolation. And that's kind of why I put the little COVID mask there, because you have to isolate it. So there's three types of allopatric speciation. And this depends, like I said, on geographic isolation. So the first one here, dispersal. This is pretty simple. This is just, let's say like, it's kind of a rough example, but you have 12 deer and then 6 of them just decide to wander off and they can't find their way back. They're isolated now, and those 6 group of deer are going to reproduce by themselves and speciate. So dispersal is just a scatter away type of idea. So they scatter away and they just kind of form their new species. Vicariance, this is like a natural barrier that separates them. And some examples would be like a river or a mountain range that will end up separating the organism or the species. And adaptive radiation, this is a good example of this is the Galapagos finches. We had this main Galapagos finch, and when you branch off into the different islands, they adapt and they radiate to suit for their survival. Now, sympatric is a little bit more complicated, and this occurs in the same geographical area. So if you think about it, if they're not isolated geographically, how can speciation occur if they're all together? And basically there's 2 ways. We have chromosomal errors and reproductive isolation. So chromosomal errors, these are just mutations and errors that just happen randomly. Here are the 3 types that we have to know. And also, if we look at reproductive isolation, we have pre and post-zygotic isolation, or barriers, actually. So pre-zygotic just means before the zygote is even formed. And the zygote just is that right before it develops and stuff like that. So pre is before zygotic, based on the definition. There is 4 types of pre-zygotic barriers, which is temporal, habitatual, behavioral, and also gametic. If we look here, this all falls under temporal. We don't worry about this post right now. So there's 4 types of pre-zygotic barriers. Temporal just means time, really. That's how I remember it. An example of this is, let's say you have a frog that mates in the summer versus a frog that mates in the winter, they won't reproduce together because they have different mating times and seasons. Habitat, this is pretty simple. If they're in different habitats, they're going to prefer to mate with the ones that are in their habitat. And lastly, we have behavioral. This is like those peacock dances and stuff like that. The female would choose the peacock with that dance versus the peacock with this dance. These are like, behavioral is just exactly what it means, behavior. So like deer fighting with each other, or like rams fighting for each other for the mate. And lastly, we have gametic. I forgot to add it on this slide, but this just means like their sexual organs and stuff like that. Now let's go over to postzygotic right here. So postzygotic means the zygote has already formed, but it is isolated, really. So an example of this, well, there's two types of postzygotic that we have to know, is hybrid sterility and hybrid inviability. What does that mean? So sterility means that it survives that first initial zygote formation, and it's generally healthy, and it survives adulthood. So an example of this is a male donkey and a female, a male donkey and a female horse, and it forms a mule. Now, the mule is healthy and it survives adulthood. However, it cannot reproduce. He's sterile. That's what it means. Now we have hybrid inviability, and this just means, for example, right here we have a leopard. So it's like a leopard and a lion combined together. And this inviability means the zygote may form, but it's very short, and it doesn't survive at all. It doesn't even see adulthood. If it does survive zygotic stage, it won't even see adulthood, and it won't be healthy. And lastly, just some things we have to know. Morphological, this is how we group species together generally. Morphological species, we have, what it means is, just based on their like physical appearances. Phylogenetic species, this is based on phylogeny and phylogenetic trees and cladograms, and we'll dive into that in a later video. And lastly, ecological species, this is just based on their ecosystems. And that's just how we can group them together. And I believe that is it. So that is yes, we are done. So that is the main background of Charles Darwin and evolution. And in our next videos, we're going to go over specific types of natural selection, phylogeny, and also Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you guys learned something. See you again.